We begin with this breaking news on the DOJ criminal January 6 probe. The Justice Department investigation into the January 6 insurrection and coup is substantially escalating. This is a story that Nicole and I just discussed, crossing just within the last hour, courtesy of the New York Times. The Justice Department count for subpoenas has drastically increased that we know of. This may have been going on privately or secretly, but the Times has busted open the story, and you see some of the names. Two top Trump advisors, including Boris Epshteyn and Mike Roman, had their phones seized, along with these 40 subpoenas. Boris Epshteyn was the Trump campaign lawyer who was directly involved in efforts that could constitute crimes or fraud. Indeed, we have endeavored to talk to every principal or source that we can in our reporting, and when we pressed him, he admitted to part of the fraudulent electors plan here on the beat. Did you ever make calls like that regarding what you're calling these alternate electors?
I was quoted in the Washington Post in the last 24 hours. Yes, I was part of the process to make sure there were alternate electors for when, as we hoped, the challenges to the seated electors would be heard and would be successful per the 12th Amendment of the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act.
That was Boris Epstein's on-the-record explanation, his view of his defense, and what others may view as a confession. Because while he may have the view that the Constitution supports what he was doing, the seizing of his phone suggests that both the DOJ and an independent judge may not view it the same way. The Times calls this a significant escalation of a probe we've known about, but a probe that has, for many months at the DOJ, focused on the ground troops, on the insurrectionists, on the people who physically stormed the Capitol that day. Remember, Mr. Epstein and others are having their phones seized. They're being hit with these subpoenas. These are individuals who are not in trouble for potentially trespassing at the Capitol. Or take Jeffrey Clark, his home searched by federal authorities pursuant to this probe. That was a sign that things were heating up on a handful of lawyers. Or John Eastman, who had his phone seized. We reported on that here by agents in New Mexico, and he released some of that video. You take this all together, and we are witnessing confirmation of the legal steps that, honestly, until today, had never reached a large number of people at the top of the Trump orbit. You have the January 6th committee investigating over here. You have the classified documents story of Mar-a-Lago that has been going strong over here. But then when you go to the DOJ and what it is doing about the coup and the planning to obstruct or hinder the counting of the votes, this is, and we've been tracking this since the beginning, this is the largest number of Trump aides who were not on the scene at the Capitol but may have been further up the line operating what is an alleged coup conspiracy. Let's get right to our experts on the breaking news. They haven't had much time to prepare, but they do know the outlines of the investigation. New York Times Magazine legal writer Emily Bazelon and former civil prosecutor Maya Wiley, president of the Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights and a former New York mayoral candidate. Maya, when you see the Times report 40 subpoenas and phone seizures, what's different about what's known for this probe today from compared to before the story broke?
Well, I think we're clear about is just how extensive the criminal investigation is, because we knew that there was an investigation on the fake electors conspiracy, right? That was something that we knew, but the extent to which it extends both January 6th, the insurrection, but also the place that the Department of Justice has arrived, because it is 40 subpoenas. I mean, what that tells us is how far along the investigation is. This is not something that the Department of Justice just does at a matter of course, it just sends subpoenas out. It's because the work they've done over the past months have led them to have reasons to subpoena the people they have subpoenaed in order to get additional evidence. It tells us that while we don't know how far along they are, and I would suggest there's still more time to go, this isn't about the midterm elections. It is about the building of evidence and how far they've come and just how far and broad the number of people who've been engaged in it may be.
Yeah, and Emily, as I mentioned, the story just crossed the wire. Like your analysis of what we're told, according to the Times sources, is one of the subpoenas at a minimum asks about anyone in the executive or legislative branch that you had contact with regarding executing the rally or trying to, quote, obstruct, influence, impede, or delay the January 6th certification. As people remember, the January 6th certification was indeed delayed criminally. What does it tell you that the subpoenas focus on that?
Well, I think it's important that the subpoenas are going to people who worked as lawyers for Trump, because that gets into the realm of attorney-client privilege. I don't think the Justice Department would do that lightly. And the focus on people in the executive or legislative branches that might have known about what transpired on January 6th, that is a reminder, of course, of Casey Hutchinson's testimony for the January 6th Congressional Committee, where you have her as this close aide talking about Mark Meadows, talking about what the White House counsel knew, and these efforts to stop Trump or to get Trump to stop the rioters, to intervene in some way. And there are statements, at least in Hutchinson's words, that Trump was not interested in doing that Meadows in particular had kind of given up. So you wonder if they're trying to get corroboration for that account, if there are other aspects of that day they are trying to nail down from multiple witnesses, because you wouldn't want the whole thing to hinge on one person's testimony. You would want to corroborate that.
Yeah, and you mentioned what it hinges on, and some of these folks we've heard about from the January 6th committee. Others, Maya, have been a little bit more behind the scenes, with their well-known in legal circles and well-known in New York. Take Bernie Kerik, former New York City police commissioner. He was pushing the voter fraud claims, and reading from the New York Times here, he was doing it with Giuliani, who, of course, has been facing multiple legal problems. The subpoenas seek information about the plan to submit, quote, slates of electors pledged to Mr. Trump from swing states that were won by Joe Biden in the 2020 election. Maya, I appreciate the New York Times clinical reference. Another way to say it is massive elector fraud, trying to steal the votes of the people in those states who voted for Biden. However you put it, what does it tell you that individuals like Mr. Kerik are now under this heat, newly reported tonight?
Well, the primary thing it tells me is, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. In other words, if in fact there are law violations and you are part of it, you are going to get caught up in it. And I want to go back to something that Emily said that was so important in terms of the lawyers, right? And Giuliani holding himself as an attorney for Donald Trump, but also Jack Wilenchek, remember, the attorney in Arizona and Phoenix, who is the one who in an email exchange with Boris Epstein said, fake electors. I mean, actually made reference to these electors as fake, which was one of the reasons why it would be surprising not to see attorneys that were engaged as part of this investigation, because even what we've seen in the public eye, whether it's Rudy Giuliani admitting in deposition testimony that he didn't have facts to back up some of the allegations he was making about voting machines, or in this case, the Epstein exchange with Wilenchek, attorneys who are actually saying and doing things that suggest that a crime fraud exception may exist. Being an attorney does not shield you from being part of an investigation or possibly being subject to an indictment if you, in fact, have been participating in a fraudulent conspiracy.
Right. And here we are 10 minutes into this breaking news story. And Emily, I'll remind viewers, we're following 40 new January 6 subpoenas. The New York Times saying they reached the upper echelon, quote, top Trump aides. We've touched on a couple. There are so many in this story that I haven't had time to mention them all. I turn now, 10 minutes in, Emily, to Dan Scavino, who may not be a household name, but the January 6 committee did bear down on him. And because Donald Trump was obsessed with publicity and how to use the internet to get publicity, Dan actually was very close to Donald Trump back when he was allowed to tweet. Now, the January 6 committee demanded his testimony. He defied them. They held him in contempt. But unlike Mr. Navarro and Mr. Bannon, the DOJ decided not to pursue him. They didn't explain the reasons. They just said they did an analysis. And that is, if I can coin a very nerdy phrase, Emily, that's very Garland. They were very careful. They did not overdo it. And at that time, we reported that. In fairness to Mr. Meadows and Mr. Scavino, they did not act on that criminal contempt referral. Now, today we learn they are subpoenaing him. And so I'm curious, Emily, A, what do you think of the significance of that in this investigation? And B, do you think Mr. Scavino has as good a shot evading a criminal subpoena as he did the House subpoena?
So I would say this is a renewed focus on the events leading up to January 6th. I don't think I realized before this that Dan Scavino might be someone the Justice Department would look at in that regard, someone who apparently they think has insider information about what happened. But the subpoena suggests that they, at least in their view, have reason to think that. And no, it's harder to evade a criminal subpoena than it is to evade a subpoena from the House committee, because a criminal subpoena comes with the possibility of contempt of court and actually going to jail if you don't abide by it. So I think that really amps things up for Scavino here.
Right. And it just, again, shows that there's so much of the iceberg that's underwater. We're just not always going to know. Scavino himself and his lawyers may have thought, wow, we got through the whole contempt thing. They may have had a couple of good weeks. This, as soon as they got the subpoena, the story's breaking tonight. We don't have the date of it, changes everything. So, again, as I told viewers, this is a breaking story. The Times calling it the biggest escalation to date in the January 6th probe as far as Trump's aides are concerned, going up the line.